Ready?
Yep.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Zibby's Bookshop, and thank you so much for coming out tonight. So we have Julie Clark and Ashley Winstead, and we're discussing Midnight is the Darkest Hour. So congratulations.
Thank you.
And it's going to be about 30 minutes of conversation, followed by audience Q&A and a book signing. So whenever you're ready.
I am ready.
Let's do it.
Okay, so I am super impressed with Ashley's bio, so I'm going to read it out loud. Ashley Winstead holds a PhD. Dr. Ashley Winstead holds a PhD in Contemporary American Literature from Southern Methodist University and a BA in English and Art History from Vanderbilt University, where she met her beloved husband.
Yes.
I added that part. She lives in Houston, Texas, where she drinks red wine, but sometimes white, works on public policy, and dreams up adult and young adult novels. She is the author of the thrillers In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife, and The Last Housewife, as well as the romance novels Fool Me Once and The Boyfriend Candidate. You can find her at ashleywinstead.com. And this book has just been optioned by Imagine.
Yep, Imagine Entertainment. Thank you.
So she's kind of a big deal, just so you know. Just so you know. Right, Uncle Russell? She is a big deal. Yes, indeed. Okay, so why don't you tell us a little bit about the book so that we can have a little bit of a framework for how we can talk.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
Eventually, my cheeks will stop being really, really warm. So Midnight is the Darkest Hour is, I feel like I say this with every one of my books, but it's a bit of a departure from what I've published previously. This is a Southern Gothic thriller, so really steeped. It's set in a small coastal Louisiana bayou town, and the book opens with a skull being pulled out of the swamp, a nearby swamp called Starry Swamp. And this small town of Bottom Springs, Louisiana, fictional, so I could play around with all sorts of things. This is like firm Southern Baptist country. This is, everyone is very morally upright. There hasn't been violence or a murder in decades, or so they think. So when this skull gets pulled out of the swamp, they don't know who it belongs to. No one's missing, they think, and how it got there. And it strikes like a chord of serious terror in the town. And the only person who believes that she knows exactly who the skull belongs to and how it got there is our protagonist, 23-year-old Ruth Cornier, the preacher's daughter, the model of good girlhood in town. And she believes she knows because she's the one who put it there years ago. And now she's realizing that the worst thing she's ever done, her worst secret, has literally become unburied. And now it's up to her and her accomplice, Everett, who shows up coincidentally after a year of missing, right as the skull has been unearthed. It's up to them to commit just a few more small crimes to throw the sheriff off their trail and, even better, redirect punishment and justice toward people they think deserve it a little bit better than them.
Very good summary. So this book, like all of your thrillers, is a bit of a genre-bending book. It's a mystery, it's a Southern Gothic, it's a romance, and it's even got a little bit of supernatural in there. So tell us a little bit about how this book came together for you. Like, how did all these pieces slide into place?
So I am just like a voracious reader. I cannot contain my reading taste. I actually signed, I don't even know if I've told you this, Julie, but I signed with my agent with a YA contemporary fantasy. So the idea of writing magic and a fantastical story has been something that I wanted to do for a really long time. And I've always had this idea in my head, this desire to write a thriller that felt so close to a fantasy and so supernatural, like it walked such a thin tightrope between realism and supernaturalism that it kept my reader on edge the entire time reading, wondering what the book and the characters were capable of, like what was going to come around the next corner. So very early on, I heard the voice of this book in my head. And this doesn't happen to me very often. Like usually I have to do a lot of character development work like do deep dives and research and write like lots in my Word docs to feel like I know a character, I know what she's gone through, and so that's how she's gonna see things, all that careful attention you want to do to your character's perspective. But Ruth came to me like supernaturally or like somehow, yeah. And I think it's because she is such a piece of me. She's 17 to 23 over the course of this book. And I really looked back to my teenage girlhood and mined a lot from that. Not the cult or occult stuff, I promise, but the feelings of being other and a misfit and finding solace in books and feeling kind of desperate for someone to swoop you up and take you from this small, stifling life into something bigger and better. So Ruth's voice, she's a reader, and to me, her voice was always very much inflected by the fantasy she read, by Twilight, which I'm sure we might get to, the Twilight of it all. So yeah, that I think her voice was supernatural from the beginning.
Okay. Yeah, you could tell. I mean, she's just very real on the page and very centered and focused, and you can really see her in a way that sometimes is hard to get right in fiction. So let's talk about her. So this is sort of a coming of age story for Ruth.
Mm-hmm.
And at the heart of this coming of age journey is her love of books, especially the ones her father disapproves of, such as Twilight. So how is this? You've mentioned that this is sort of a love letter to Twilight. So let's talk a little bit more about, since you brought it up. How is this more of a love letter to Twilight than maybe you intended it to be?
Thank you. I love that question. So I will start this part of the conversation by confessing that I was a little bit too old for Twilight Mania. And so I watched my slightly younger female teenage contemporaries just fall in love with Twilight, Team Edward, Team Jacob, just the whole 9 yards, release parties. And I was the kind of literary nerd as a young girl who was like, well, I'm reading Jane Austen, and not Stephanie Meyer. And so I was a snob about Twilight, full confession. And it wasn't until I then went to grad school to get my PhD where I was surrounded by a ton of other snobs and realized what I looked like from the outside, looking back. And I remember going out for beers with a bunch of my fellow grad students. And as it was very in vogue to do back then, everyone was shitting on Twilight, everyone was kind of talking about the
poorly written.
And my very best friend in my grad program had taught in an underserved community at a school, 5th, 6th, and 7th graders before coming into grad school. And she listened to us talk completely silent. And when there was a lull in the conversation, she said, you know what, you guys, say what you want about it, but the only thing that has made readers out of my students for years is me introducing them to Twilight. So maybe do what we call nerdily in grad school a reparative reading, which is when you stop applying a super critical analytic eye to things and start considering the work it does in the world, and think about what it can mean to people. And that just struck me. And I asked myself in that moment, why does it feel so easy to punch down at Twilight? And I realized it was because it was what the gauche girls that I wanted to distance myself with my superior reading taste liked. And all of a sudden I realized what terrible things I was doing with this. And I've been on this Twilight renaissance that I'm really excited to see everyone is on right now. And I feel like this book fits very comfortably. I promise I'll talk more about the book in a second, but this book fits very comfortably in this movement we're experiencing right now, girl dinner, girl math, the celebration of things that used to be stigmatized, like femininity, softness, silliness, all the things about girlhood that, it's not girl bosses are gone. We're like soft girls now. We're Taylor Swift girlies. We're okay with emotions and softness. This is a book that fits really comfortably in that this is kind of my girl dinner book, like my attempt to take Twilight seriously, take the question of why a 14-year-old girl like Ruth Cornier finding Twilight when she's not supposed to. It's a banned book because it's about a vampire, right? Which is a cult, which is something her pastor father bans from town or bans from anyone reading. And it's about a young woman who feels like a misfit, just like her, who finds this extraordinary love in this otherworldly boy, he's very old, but putting that aside, who then kind of makes her life extraordinary through their connection. And when I started writing this book, I was convinced that the same things that would draw a teenage girl to feeling just passionately obsessed with that story are the same instincts that make some people very religious, like this desire for transcendence and a life that's bigger than the one that you're given. And so I wanted to make that argument in this book. So this is my, like, both my redemption for being a literary snob and like an earnest argument that Twilight can save.
Is there a Twilight redemption going on right now?
There's a Twilight Renaissance going on.
I did not know
So
that.
the films are, when they were, I don't know if they're still on the streamers right now, but they were recently all on the streamers and they were like doing blockbuster numbers again.
Good for
It's all over
them.
the memes, the social media. Yeah.
All I know about Twilight, and then we're going to get back to Ashley's story.
Yeah.
All I know is that I was like 100 months pregnant with a preschooler rolling into Barnes and Noble to be like, give me all the Twilights. I need them. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever, however many there are, like, I need them now. And like, yes.
So I reread the Twilight Saga before reading this because I wanted to, be up on my stuff. And there's this moment in, I think it's the third book, and it's after Bella, sorry for any spoilers for anyone who hasn't read the saga yet, but it's after Bella has been transformed into a vampire. And there's this line where she says, I've always been a monster, and I think I was waiting for Edward to just kind of officially make me one. I'm paraphrasing, but it's this extraordinary line that I thought, am I reading Twilight right now? Like, this is such an apt description of what it feels like to be a teenage girl convinced that you're powerful and dangerous and no one will see it or give it to you. And when I pitched this book to my agent, I said, I want to write a thriller that feels like that really terrible relationship you first get into when you're a teenage girl with the worst person in the world, where you will then light the world on fire in defense of that person and you make all the mistakes. And I want to write a book that feels like that, except my readers are like, you know what? This is awful, but you go. Like, I'm with you all the way.
Yeah,
so,
we've all had that relationship, and we're still cheering for it in some way, right?
Beautiful. I've done my work.
Okay, so Ruth is a librarian whose teenage years were shaped by reading books that were banned by her father and by the religion of her town. In some ways, did you see this book as a bit of a statement against the historic book banning we've been seeing in the United States in the last several years?
Yeah, so I live in Texas, which is like ground zero for book banning. And all of my local bookstores, Blue Willow they're like leading the legal defense, the legal action against the new rating law. It's all everyone's talking about. It's absolutely, it's both like not surprising at all because that's the first move of totalitarians and fascists, right? Like we see it over and over again through history. It's, of course, go for the books first. That's how people are finding, enlarging their perspectives and finding community outside the small communities that they physically belong to. It's, the biggest freedom and democratization.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Intellectual democratizing tool that we have is books and the written language. So yes, absolutely, very purposefully. In fact, I published 2 books in 2023. They both have librarian main characters. One's a romance, one's a thriller, and they're both about like book banning. And in the romance, actually the main character is like leading rallies against book banning, and that's what she's up to. And here Ruth isn't quite that bold. She's learning agency throughout the course of the book. But yeah, absolutely, this is a statement.
And it is National Book Banning Week, by the way. So please, please, please look for those books that are being banned and buy them. So
Yep.
yeah, Zibby's has a whole bunch of them, I'm sure.
Can I just say also, I described Ruth as a librarian when I was, I think, describing her to someone on like a marketing or a publicist, and she was like, let me correct you. She's never had formal librarian training, so she only works in a library. And I was like, oof, that hurts me on behalf of this fictional character that I've just, but okay, yep, I feel you.
She's not a librarian. Okay. All right. I'll fix my question.
So just in case anyone is upset about that.
I don't think anybody would be, but okay. Maybe the librarians. I don't know. They seem a very forgiving group, though.
They really do.
Yeah. So can you tell us about Bottom Springs, Louisiana, and how you crafted this fictional town, and why was this the setting you needed to tell this story?
Yeah. So there are two reasons. One is that one is a little more personal, and one is the fact that my sister lived in southern Louisiana for a few years, and I would do the drive from Houston to New Orleans, and it's a 5-hour drive, and you pass through many of the towns that I write about. And so I was able to actually go and be in these small towns. And I grew up in southern Florida my teenage years and had a lot of exposure to swampland, Floridian swampland. And to me, there is no more evocative or frightening setting than the swamp. Like that to me is like, if you're going to imagine a fairy tale or otherworldly place located here on Earth, it's the swampland, because you've got that dark, opaque water you can't see into. You know what's lurking in there. It's alligators and snakes and things that you don't want to come in contact with. You know, but then above there's gorgeous tree canopies and there's bird song, and it's this mix, this kind of like really evocative mix of danger and beauty. And so when I thought about what space would lend itself to a fairy tale-esque setting, it was the swamp for sure. And the other, like the Bottom Springs of it all, I mentioned that I was doing some emotional excavation of my own past with Ruth, kind of looking back to my own 17 to 23-year-old self. And what I remember from that time is like this intense claustrophobia, like this intense feeling that I needed to get out. I needed to build through like scholarships or whatever I needed to do. I needed to build myself an escape route out of what felt like a very stifling place in this small town in Florida that I was a teenager in. And this Southern Baptist church that my parents had recently started attending. So I knew immediately that I wanted to write about a small town in which just everywhere you went felt for Ruth like she's being surveyed by everyone. Everyone knows everyone's business. Everyone's watching when you walk down the street. She knows that every time she steps out the door, especially when she does it with Everett, her best friend, the town outcast, it's a performance because people are talking and thinking. And so I wanted to try to recreate that feeling of almost unbearable claustrophobia that you have when you're a certain kind of teenage girl or teenager with Bottom Springs.
Well, and she's the preacher's daughter.
She's the preacher's daughter.
It's a very fundamentalist town.
Yep.
That also relies heavily on like the occult and the stories of the low man. And so how do you sort of navigate that evangelical thread with the occult? Because I mean, honestly, both sides of that coin, you're going to get banned.
Yeah. Well, to me, I see a strain of magical thinking that runs through, really, really fundamentalist, certain strains of religion. in which there's, the Bible is interpreted very, very literally. And there is this heaven that exists above us and this hell that exists below us, ruled over by, a devil and his hierarchy of demons. And I come by that fairly honestly because my parents, like I mentioned, joined a Southern Baptist church that was way more rigid than I expected. And my family went like full hook, line, and sinker into this new world when I was a teenager. And just as I was starting to feel my rebellious years and sensibilities emerge, they were starting to say things like, oh, you should not be like dating boys and experimenting sexually. You're a young woman. Meanwhile, this didn't exist for my younger brothers. And I was just feeling like this. In my parents' defense, I started dating a very bad boy who was a felon. And and in their defense, as one does, I told you, like, the bad boy, terrible decisions.
I mean, if Russell wasn't going to get the dedication, probably that guy was. Right?
I owe him no more after all those. Yeah, I defended him. I gave him more than he deserved. Let's say that. Yeah. So Russell's probably like, oh dear God, I'm learning so much right now. Yeah. Okay, good. Mom has told you.
We'll talk later.
Yeah,
Russell.
we'll talk later. So basically I read the Left Behind books as a kid. They scarred me. I like to joke that there's like a Left Behind to Midnight is the Darkest Hour pipeline. Like if you were scarred by middle grade books about how the apocalypse was right around the corner and you're about to be left behind because you're a sinner, then read this and maybe it'll be a little cathartic. But to my mind, sitting where I am now in my 30s, looking back at all of this and watching evangelicals kind of do a lot of negative things in our country, I just see a complete through line of the same sort of magical thinking that allows you to believe in like the devil and superstition, and that you need to cross black cats when you see them, which is something that my mama does. And in my experience, the most superstitious people I've ever met have also been the most religious. And I think there's just something about the ability to believe that there's something more going on underwriting that allows you to kind of stretch in one direction and maybe a little bit in the other. And so for me, one of the most important things about Ruth is that she's grown up in this life. So even when she feels she rejects a lot of her father's religion, her mind has been shaped by this fundamental idea that there's more going on. She just needs to find exactly what it is. So it allows her to believe in, maybe there are romantic vampires living among us. Maybe there are ways to be saved that she hasn't imagined yet.
So I want to talk a little bit about Everett because you've mentioned him a few times. But I think everybody needs to understand that Everett is really like, he's the guy we're reading this book for.
Yes.
So
my favorite book boyfriend.
Yeah.
For sure.
So tell us a little bit about Everett. And he's very complex.
Yeah.
He has a moral compass that is hard to read, I would say.
Yep.
But yet he is the one person that Ruth really relies on for everything. So talk a little bit about him and how his moral compass maybe isn't as straight as her preacher father would like it to be, and yet he's actually her true like North Star.
Oh, that's beautifully put.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. So when I was thinking about Everett, I knew that I needed to develop a character to kind of like create this person who is so magnetic and so compelling that he's the kind of person a girl would leave everything she's known and say like, you know what? I want to cast my lot with you. And so how I imagined, but I also wanted readers to have a kind of double vision when it came to Everett, like to see the romantic hero. He's very beautiful. He's so beautiful that Ruth sometimes finds herself so struck by him that she is like, you're otherworldly. How did you get here in Bottom Springs, Louisiana? Like, you stick out like a sore thumb amongst the rest of us. Like, who are you? You look like you come from one of my stories. So he's got that going on, but he is one of the most loathed people in town, second only to his father, who is, if Ruth's preacher father is like the Messiah / mayor of town unofficially, then his polar opposite would be Everett's father, who's the town drunk. He gets in vicious fights when he drinks too much at the local bar. And Everett's always having to like come and bail him out. And everyone hates them. They live in near poverty because Everett's father doesn't take care of him. And so Everett runs around in threadbare clothes grows up running around threadbare clothes, having to fend for himself. But instead of seeing his circumstances and responding to them with like kindness or the things you're supposed to do as like a Christian community, everyone recoils and says like, oh my God, those awful Duncans, which is their last name. So I always imagined Everett as this person that everyone in school, he was like that gross guy in school, where you're like, oh no, not him again. I'm seated next to him. And you're like, oh, his clothes are stained. And Ruth has always been extremely intimidated by him because they call him a freak. They call him a Columbiner. They really stigmatize him and what he's capable of. So she's scared of him. And then, without any spoilers, he meets her and helps her in a very critical moment in her life. And these two misfit outcasts, their friendship is forged. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, Ruth sees not someone to be afraid of, but someone who's just like her, like a twin soul, someone who is misunderstood, who's been cast into this role. There's some line in the book where they say, like, we've always had a soft spot for monsters in stories because we understood how easy it is to be like villainized and demonized. And Everett offers her a vision of right and wrong and justice that looks very different from her father's and the Holy Fire Baptist Church. And to her, it feels more correct. Like if the people who are in charge are themselves violent or corrupt, you do something to correct that, right? Mm-hmm. He has a vigilante sense of justice. And to Ruth, that starts to look more and more like real, actual justice, as opposed to like, the laws and the religious tenets.
Which are not always set up to protect women.
Absolutely, or anyone vulnerable.
Right.
And in fact, Ruth starts to see are really just set up to serve the people in power,
right,
who want to keep it.
All right. So last question, and I can't say a lot about it, but maybe you and I can talk later. The ending of this book is incredibly shocking and ambiguous. AshleyWinstead.com is how you can reach her to ask any questions you might have.
Yeah.
However, talk a little bit about why you felt like that was the best ending for this book. It's phenomenal.
Thank you.
But you're gonna. I told you when I read it, I was like, you're gonna get a lot of emails, and she's like, I know.
Yep, I'm ready. Yeah. So I normally like to say I knew the ending from the very beginning, because normally I do with my books, but not this one. This one, I had a completely different ending in mind that was so bonkers and so completely off the wall and changed the entire genre of the book in like the last 2 paragraphs.
I'm sorry. Wait.
Julie,
Stop.
it could have been weirder.
Stop.
That's what I'm saying to you.
Because it's bonkers now.
No, my agent said no. Like, absolutely not. You're not allowed to do this. You've set up a contract with your reader that they are coming in and expecting a certain kind of book, and it's a cheat to then say, oh, the big twist is
They're aliens.
exactly that sort of thing. Yeah, this all makes sense, and I've tied all my, everything into a nice pretty bow because something that you never could have guessed.
They're ghosts.
Yeah, or something like that.
Okay.
And my agent was like, not in this house do we do things like that. She's like, you got to work for it. And I appreciate that now, though. There was a week or two of sadness because I was really excited about this very bonkers ending. And I wish I could tell you all. DM me later after you finish the book, and I'll tell you what the original ending was going to be. But this ending, which I will also not spoil, as soon as I put that one out of my mind, it was like, my agent is correct, as she usually is. Back to the drawing board. Let's think about who these characters are. I realized that Ruth and Everett survive in the town of Bottom Springs, in this book, in their community, by carving out this interstitial space between the world of Bottom Springs and the church and this other world, this fantasy world, this nature world where they can be free. They live in between, and that's their salvation. And so for me, I felt like there was no greater gift that I could give to these two characters than somehow allow them to live in this world in perpetuity. And so that is my explanation that I hope didn't spoil anything for anyone. But I really wanted to do that. And I also Ruth throughout the book is trying to figure out right and wrong. And she's trying to understand, like, okay, given this new set of circumstances, these new things I've learned about people who I thought were like very morally upright, what is the right thing to do now that I've discovered this? And so she has this kind of running motif of like imagining the scale of justice in her mind and her actions and Everett's actions versus other people's. And is she still going to go to heaven, because is she still going to be on the side of right? And so she's doing so much of this calculation that by the end of the book, she doesn't know. And I wanted to leave that final judgment up to readers to kind of leave that in their hands as the so-called, gods and goddesses, whatever, deities of the book.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm opening it up now to all of you. Questions?
Questions.
Yeah.
So you mentioned a little bit at the end, your agent pushing back and saying like you have a contract with the reader, and it made me think about when you were talking earlier about genre blending.
Yeah.
Did you have like certain, without spoiling anything, certain rules that were like thriller versus supernatural? Like, did you make like a set of like rules for yourself? I can go this far, but I can't violate this, or I push it too far into one genre. Like, I'm just wondering how you kind of navigated that.
It was hard because I wanted to completely run over the lines and just really mash them together. And I felt like I did give myself a little bit of leeway. I thought everything that is within someone's imagination or that someone could possibly believe is fair game. So the moment that I put a real supernatural creature on the page, I've broken that contract, and now it's a different kind of book. Now you live in a world where, I really hope I'm not spoiling anything, but now you live in a world where these things do exist. Everything up to that point, and I do go some weird places in the book with what people are driven to do, very violent, arcane, strange things because they believe they're serving these superstitions. And boy, it was fun writing. Like, I'm obsessed with like satanic panic and like that era of our culture, and the idea that people were walking around like serious people, police, religious leaders, communities, moms, walking around very much believing that right around the corner in their neighborhood was a full-blown satanic cult sacrificing children, and that like they needed to go find and like ferret out. I love that like that's so weird, and I'm a thriller writer, so it's very cool to me that was like this fever, this fervor. People honestly were believing in that. So I wanted to capture that energy and write about a more contemporary version of satanic panic unfolding. So yeah, that line really was only like, if I say yes to their fear and put it on the page, I've gone too far. Everything else is fair game.
I kind of have a two-part question. You kind of touched on, you created a fictional place.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if in your other books you've written about real cities or places. Julie, I know you have. But like, why choose one over the other? How do you get into it? What are the pros and cons, I guess?
Yeah.
And the other question is, you had mentioned the swamp as being like eerie and like good place to kind of set a book like this. How can you really like dig into making the setting more creepy in that way? By using like those sorts of elements?
Amazing questions. And I'll start with the first because it's actually a really easy answer. I always love writing about fictional places because then I can do whatever the hell I want. Like no one's going to write me an email being like, you got it wrong about, Hoboken, it's just like, it's so much creative freedom. So the only books that, Housewife, I set, I guess, technically in the Hudson Valley. Yeah. I took some liberties, but I also had my Hudson Valley living agent pour through everything to make sure. But for the most part, I like creating fictional places where it's like a fictional university and In My Dreams I Hold a Knife in a real city, or a fictional little place in the Hudson Valley. It's like I try to have my cake and eat it too, where it feels like, okay, I know the reader's like, I know where this is, but at the same time, the only person making the rules is me. And I prefer that because I really will get. My favorite interview question that I got for In My Dreams I Hold a Knife was this very exasperated journalist who was like, I have looked for Duquesne University online for so long. Where is it? Why doesn't it have a web presence? And I'm like, I made it up. Like
You
that
did a
does
good job.
not. All,
Yeah.
I appreciated that,
You
and
did
he
a
was
good
like,
job.
he was not happy. So for Bottom Springs, I knew I was going to do such outrageous things in Bottom Springs that I needed to set it in a fictional place. And the other part of your question was just the eeriness of the swamp and
like
how do you
play into the setting to make something creepier or like ratchet up kind of that tension.
Yeah, I love that. It was easy with the swamp because so one of the things that Ruth, when she pushes away from this, rigid religion of her parents in the town, she is still a very spiritual being, right? And she redirects all of that feeling into nature. So nature for her becomes, the swamp becomes a chapel, the forest is a religious place. She has so much reverence for nature. And I think that being able to like walk that line, it was important for me with the swamp. And it's kind of the same thing I was trying to do with the title. The swamp is terrifying to me, and it's terrifying to the majority of the people in Bottom Springs. For Everett and Ruth, it becomes their holy place. It becomes not a site of terror, but the only place where no one else is watching them and they can be free. And I think when you make your reader emotionally invested in a setting like that, when you turn that setting on its head and make it betray your readers or your characters that are emotionally connected to it, then all of a sudden your reader is feeling that same betrayal, feeling like you made me feel safe in the swamp and now you're striking out, like a snake fangs.
Now there's a skull there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And now it's betrayed you. So I think there's that. And also just having the entire community of Bottom Springs whispering and talking and mythologizing about this swamp. It's just like, that's all the beautiful work. That's like the rumor mongering that you do, that even no matter how beautifully or eerily you describe it when you have your characters there, that's like good work that they're doing, spreading that. Did I answer your question? Okay, good.
Thank you.
I noticed that, and I'm only halfway through, like I said, but
Thank
I
you for
noticed
reading.
there's kind of a lack of technology, which
Yeah.
makes her feel even more sheltered.
Mhm,
Like
yeah.
she's not on Twilight TikTok or anything.
Yeah.
There's Twilight TikTok.
Oh yeah, we're in our Twilight Renaissance, Julie. That's right. Yeah.
But what is that kind of to keep it more timeless?
Yeah. I actually really struggled with that because I meant for this to be a contemporary story. But I also knew that technology would open the world for Ruth in ways that I didn't see her being open to. Like, without spoiling things, she really is locked in Bottom Springs. And she does go on the computer at the library, she like researches college classes and syllabi and things like that. So she does have access to that, but there were a few things that I drew on. And one is the fact that Ruth is taking care of herself financially. So she doesn't have the money for a lot of technology. Her access to the internet is at the library where she works. So there's kind of a limitation there. Ruth, for a lot of the story, is a very sheltered young woman. And there's this line where she says, like, the bars of the prison are really in my own mind, right? Like that's really, and so I think there's a certain self-limitation, but she also has a cell phone. So it's like, my agent was like, when is this set? And are there places like this in the world? She's like, I live in New York. Like, this feels like it doesn't exist. And I'm like, it absolutely does. And there's a certain amount of anti-technology sentiment within a lot of fundamentalist religions. And I know that the Southern Baptist Church that my entire family and me for a little while were attending in Florida, you were discouraged from reading anything secular, from listening to secular music, from watching secular movies, like nothing. God forbid I wanted to watch Buffy, which I really wanted to watch as a young person. Just no, I had to wait until my 20s to watch it. But yeah, so I think that also, between the money and lack of access to technology issues and the kind of like culture issues, I figured I could keep Ruth locked because technology would have been like a world opener for her. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Since your book is now optioned for TV, in a perfect world, what actors or actresses you have in mind to play for your characters?
So I need help with Everett. He's hard because he has to be like this perfect mix of beautiful and dangerous and very compelling, but also feral, which is how Ruth describes him. So like, if you know of an actor like that, please shout it out or DM me. It's like one of my the folks in the production company that I was casting with was like, it's like if Timothée Chalamet was bulkier and like a little bit more substantive, frame-wise. And I was like, yes, that makes sense. That's a good, but my Ruth in my Pinterest board for this book has always been Sadie Sink from Stranger Things, who made that Kate Bush song, Running Up the Hill, very popular. To me, she has this beautiful mix of like fierceness, but vulnerability, youth, but kind of like wisdom beyond her years. And that's how I always saw Ruth. And then I'm waiting for, I don't know if you know Gare Billings on Instagram, but I'm basically waiting for Gare to do the casting. And then I'll be like, this is the official casting. Yeah, he does love Jacob Elordi.
He would work, I think.
Yeah, he could work.
He's not very sharp featured though.
But he does have danger, like after Euphoria, and he's pretty. Yeah.
I don't know who any of these people are. I'm like Kevin Bacon, Sean Penn, Rob Lowe.
You know, Rob
I'm too old for
Lowe.
this.
He's still very pretty. Yeah, like, okay, yep. Yeah. I love that. Basically, I need your help, so please send me ideas. Yeah.
I've been a fan since your debut and
Thank
just
you.
really impressed with like your range and just the different types of stories that you put out. I remember when I saw Fool Me Once, I'm like, she does political romance too? I was like, this is crazy. I'm just curious, what was the easiest story for you to write and what was the most difficult?
Yeah. Thank you, first of all. And I would say the easiest story for me to write was In My Dreams, my debut. In some ways, in the sense that it really flowed out of me. I drafted the entire thing in 4 months while working a full-time job that I worked very long hours at, because I was like in the political world, which is why I then wrote political romances. But to me, that's a really short period of time to write a book. Anyway, so that was the easiest one. And I still actually go back now and romanticize the drafting process. Like I look back at it very nostalgically. That book just flowed out of me. And I think it was because I thought my writing career was over after Pitch Wars. Hallie knows. Well, you had great success, but we did this mentoring program, and I like flopped in this program. And I was really, really sad, thought, God, you've been trying for like 2 years to get someone to pay attention to you. When is the point you start to say like, this dream just isn't going to be for you? Which I know it should be a lot longer than 2 years. I know that now as someone who's now been in the industry for a little while. But at that time, it just felt like dark night of the soul. And so I started writing In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife as a place to channel all of my toxicity. And it was almost like this way to exorcise that part of my personality, put it in a character called Jessica Miller, and then like Lancer, and so that just was like a confession. The hardest one to write was Midnight, which I think is why I'm most proud of this book, because for the first time in my writing life, I had writer's block where it just stopped. My process, that was my golden little process that always worked for me, just produced nothing. And I annoyed so many writer friends by being like, what do you do? Tell me, please. Like, how do you get, like, are there crystals I can buy and put under my pillow? Like, what do you do when this happens to you? And they're like, oh, you just like read a lot of other books and it'll happen, trust me. And I was just like, no, I need something, and like concrete answer. And they were all right. It was me putting this book down, going off and writing a different genre, and then returning to this book, and suddenly everything was back. And I knew how I was gonna draft this book, and it was flowing. So this book, every word was a struggle. So that is why I'm now looking at it like, thank God you exist,
I made a face during that question at Suzanne because Suzanne and I met during Pitch Wars. We did Pitch Wars together.
Why do I forget
in 2016?
this?
It was 2016, right?
All of
Yeah.
us
Yes.
Pitch Wars traumatized people. Yeah. Group therapy session
Okay.
later. Yep.
Question.
Are you writing the script for the film?
I am not, because I do not know how to do that. And for a moment, I thought to myself, because Midnight is my third book that's been optioned. So I've had this conversation now 3 times. Yep. Like, and how big a role would you like to have? Do you want to be a writer? And every time I'm like, nope, let a professional do this, because I don't want my book to be the victim of me learning how to screenwrite on this
Right.
project. So no, just 100% want professionals. The one cool thing I've been able to do is the writer that's attached to In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife. She and I have become very good friends. And so she FaceTimes me when she gets stuck. And we go back and forth and talk through ideas and ways to flesh out the story. And I'm like, you know what? I think that character would do that, or they would do something even wilder. So that has given me like this feeling like I maybe am a little bit part of it, but now I want the professionals to handle that.
And
Is
you
that
keep-
how you feel?
Yeah, I don't want to write it.
Okay.
I mean, I want the executive producer title.
Yes.
You can give me that.
Yep.
But and I will consult on an as needed basis.
Yep.
But yeah, no, I want somebody who knows what they're doing to do that, because it's a whole different skill set. And I feel
Yes.
like, I've written 3 books, almost 4, and I feel like I'm just learning how to do this job.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is, it's a hell of a lot of work.
It really is.
And
then they go on strike, and then you can't do anything. So,
Exactly.
yeah.
But like sometimes when that dream screenwriter FaceTimes me, I'm like, I do not have time for this. I'm on deadline for a book.
I have
like,
my own book to write.
Exactly. So learning boundaries and how to say no.
So semi two parts. The one, like, is that contemporary YA fantasy that you started with ever going to see the light of day? But relatedly, obviously you write in multiple genres, and I know you just said like sometimes it maybe helps even to break writer's block to switch to a different genre. But can you talk a little bit about what it's like to kind of go back and forth, and also I know you're going into yet another genre soon. So is there any, are there any others that you're maybe going to or try to explore in the future, or something that's like a dream project?
I love those questions. Thank you. And if you want to read this YA, I will send it to you, because it will never,
I will.
it'll never see the light of day, unless I take it and somehow figure out a way to turn it into an adult thriller. Which I think I might maybe be able to do. So we'll see. But as a YA fantasy, sometimes your agent is just really blunt with you, and I appreciate that. And my agent at one point in the revision process was just like, "You're not making this work. Like, it's not novel enough. What are you adding to the YA field?" And I was like, "Oof, ouch." Once I recovered from that email, then I was like, yeah, nothing. So let's put this down and see what I can do with it later. But in terms of other genres, I have the beginnings of a manuscript in every genre in my laptop. I'm not joking. There's adult fantasy. There's like sci-fi. There's a middle grade. When I'm feeling whimsical, I'm like, oh, middle grade. So really, anything that my agent and the publishing industry will let me get away with, because I feel so hungry. I've said this before, but like, I'm a very ambitious woman, and I love other ambitious women, and I'm hungry to I've always had this idea that I want to leave a legacy. And to me, that's like 60 or 70 books. I'm in my 30s, so I feel like I can do it. And so how you do that, given the realities of the publishing market, is hopping genres, because you're contractually bound in genres. So there's just that hunger, and also the idea that on my Kindle and on my bookshelf are books of every genre, and they are so inspiring. And I'm like, at some level, I feel like I'm still figuring out my chameleon identity and who I want to be. So I want to try on all these voices. And that feels like creatively liberating to me. And it feels so energizing, bouncing between genres. So basically by the end of a thriller, I'm like, good Lord, I've traumatized myself. And I've made all these psychic wounds. And now I need to live in a light and happy world. So I'll write a romance and I'll heal myself. And then by the end of the romance, I will think things have been happy way too long. Let's get back to stabbing people. And then I'll jump into that. And it just feels like I'm keeping that balance going. Did I?
Yeah.
Okay. I was like, I feel like maybe there's one more question in there that I didn't.
I think you hit them all.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming.
Thank you all
Appreciate
so
it.
much.
Very wonderful. Let's give her a
Thank
hand.
you. Thank you. Thank you all for being here so much. It means so much to me. Thank you, Julie.
So yes, Ashley's here to sign your books. How do you want to do it?
You guys can see there. We can move you over to some other chairs over here, whatever's more comfortable. But we have copies of Julie and Ashley's books up at the front.
Yes.
Awesome.
And everyone needs to read, if you haven't, The Lies I Tell and The Last Flight.
Thank
They're
you.
absolutely incredible. Julie's my hero and a role model for me. So yeah, if you want to read just like the best thrillers of the last few years, read those books. That's my pitch.
Thank you. All right.
How about 30 seconds on your book?
Yes.
The Lies I Tell is a story of Meg Williams, who's a con artist, and she travels the country under assumed names, creating false identities and backstories to back up whatever lies she's telling. And she is finally ready to move home to pull her last con on the man who she thinks destroyed her life when she was a young girl. But what she doesn't know is that there's a journalist back in Los Angeles who was collateral damage on the last con that she pulled there, who's been silently and quietly waiting for her to return. And so it's a cat and mouse story. You don't really know who's the cat and who's the mouse. They're sort of after each other. So
good.
that's The Lies I Tell.
Oh, it's amazing.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right, thank
Let's
you.
do it. Thank you all. Yay.
Yay, good job.
Thank you. Thank you for those
job.
amazing questions.
Well,
and
Christina came up, so thank her.
the whole conversation.